Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last week of class, the last two lectures. Can't believe it's already the end. This session flew by, but it was a good one. So we're gonna start. Before we talk about our lecture today on organizational planning in chapter 13, I was gonna go over real quick the final exam and your last opportunity for extra credit. So we're going to start by talking about the exam and stuff like that first. So, as you know, we have the final exam. This is basically what it's going to cover. It's covering chapters 7 through 14. And it's everything past the midterm. Nothing from prior to the midterm is going to be on it. So you only have to focus on this last half of these last 7 chapters. That includes like theory, associations, public interest groups, this chapter on organizational planning, and the next one, as well as like criminal organizations and stuff like that. So I gave you a couple hints here to focus on Merton's modes of adaptation and the application of it. If you haven't noticed, a lot of our lectures have talked about this. Merton's modes of adaptation a bunch, not just in chapter 8 where we introduced it, but onward. It is mentioned in multiple chapters. So I'd make sure I understand how that applies both for individuals as well as for organizations, because it could go either way. Because it's mentioned so much, I would expect a good bit of questions on it. I would also make sure to know your different types of public interest groups and some examples of each of them. If I did an example question, I would pick something either directly from the lecture or something that's very obviously an example of it. Such like a simple Google search would tell you a most popular one would be good for that. Make sure you know the constructions framework and the McAdams-Scott framework from social movements. Like I said, with the McAdams-Scott, that was that 7-element one. I wouldn't focus on application of it and stuff like that. I would focus on just knowing that there are 7 pieces of it, and I would know each piece of it. But I wouldn't go any step further. Just like I said, you don't have to go into incredible detail on those. Also talk about countercultures. I would make sure to study like some examples of counterculture. Like I said, with the hippie movement and stuff like that, and how those apply. As well as elements for criminal organization. Elements of a criminal organization I would focus on as well, because we spent a good bit of chapter 12 talking about different elements, both legally based on statutes as well as based on what academics call it. I would make sure to look over those because you spent a good deal of time. For this chapter, we're going to talk about gap analysis, SWOT analysis, and logic modeling. So I'd spend some time looking over that kind of stuff, as well as informatics systems. The next chapter is information systems, and there's a good bit of different types that may be applicable to criminal justice contexts. So make sure you can apply different types of information systems to criminal justice system as well, and that's going to be the next chapter that goes over that. So, last couple things about the exam. I'm going to give you an extra 10 minutes from last time. You get 90 minutes instead of 80. I didn't want to give you any more because I don't want to detract you from actually studying and preparing for the information. And if we were in a normal class period, you would have only have had 80 minutes to do so. And it would be easily done in those 80 minutes. So I'm not going to give any more extra time. It's still open note. It's still open book, open notes. But I would definitely study it beforehand so you can answer the questions faster and have more time to go over it. So you have that extra 10 minutes. You don't need to have lockdown. You don't need to honor lock, nothing like that. As long as but I can see your logs and stuff to see what you've been doing. Always let me know if something goes wrong or you lose internet halfway through or something, and I can check on my end to see what happened. And I would prefer knowing that sooner rather than later in case something happens. I don't get a ton of time to turn grades around, so it's easier to get it done quicker and taken care of so that way I can finalize grades and stuff like that before the deadline for the school and stuff like that. And I want to get grades up a little early. I would like to have grades up a little bit more earlier too, so that way you can take a look at it and make sure they're correct before they're submitted. And of course I'm going to give you a notice when everything is updated and as current as it can before I submit it to the school, so that way you can take a good look at it. So, another information about the exam, it's going to be 50 questions. My cat is like attacking me at the moment. 50 questions, and they're each going to be worth about 2 points each, like last time. Make sure you pay attention to the due date. We're moving it to Thursday, June 18th by midnight. I moved it up a day so that way I can get grades finalized and give time so you can see your grades. Because big grades are due like the next week. I think it's like 3 days after class ends and stuff like that. So I need to have some time to grade the exam as well as grade article critiques that just turned in, as well as anything else last minute. So that's why that due date is moved from Friday. So make sure you pay attention to that. And I will make sure to let you know that, hey, it's due on this day. And it's going to be open on Monday. So it's probably open by now. So make sure you complete it before the due date. That's pretty much it for the exam front. It should be pretty standard like last time. So I'm going to give you an option to do extra credit once again, as like I said in the syllabus. So this is the same extra credit protocol. You just upload a screenshot of confirmation that you have did the assignment. Okay. That you have done the assignment and everything. So there's 2 surveys going on right now. You have the SurveyMonkey survey, which is similar to what we did for the midterm. And then you have the official FSU one. So you can do either one. You don't have to do both. You can choose, if you already did the official one, just upload proof that you did it. I'm pretty sure it sends you like an email saying, hey, you completed this. It's like a certificate or whatever. If you send me that, that's fine. So you can do the official one, or you can take the link that I have on the Canvas page and do that one. It's still anonymous. Just provide me with some kind of proof that you took it, and I'll give you 5 points. Either one is fine. You don't have to do both, like I said. It just gives me feedback to prepare. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be teaching this course in the spring, probably. So I'd like to have some feedback and stuff like that, or what I could alter with the class, in addition to what y'all have already suggested, which I took into account. So that's pretty much it from that front as well for extra credit. It's due the same day the exam is, so I would just upload it, and I'll add 5 points like last time and tell you that I added the 5 points to your final. So yeah, that's pretty much it on that front too. So with that being said, we're going to start on the actual material, which is going to be on organizational planning. And this lecture is going to be a little bit longer. There's a good bit of information we're going to cover today. But it's actually pretty interesting. It's stuff and common sense kind of stuff. So we're going to spend some time on that. So organizations planning. Organizations are typically going to use a rational approach to planning. We've talked about rational and everything like that before, so that's not really a surprise. CJ organizations in particular are going to be super clear on their outcomes because they want to focus on them and then improve and reach them. And they want them to be measurable. So those outcomes that they want to get to, they want to be able to measure and see that they actually achieve those. So it's the beginning, basically organizational planning in a broad sense. So we're going to talk about this idea of change versus planned change. The book makes a distinction, and it's kind of important to cover. So by now you probably know what change is, but the book kind of like defines it as a observable difference between two time periods, so time 1 and time 2. If there's a difference between those two, it's called change. That's common sense. Planned change refers to changes like that are purposeful, based on decision making and planning. So actual conscious effort has been put in to produce these changes. So that's what would be a planned change. So it's planned, it's been planned ahead, and stuff like that. It didn't come spur of the moment or accidentally. It's conscious effort. So that would be planned change. Planned change is kind of useful because it has the goal of producing improvements to the organization. And it also could be defined as conscious or deliberate change, like we mentioned. So just the difference between change and planned change. So what is organizational planning? So we know what planning is. We just have to apply it to organizations. So it's the process of preparing for the future and preparing organizations for the future. Like I said, the future is given like immense consideration, meaning that it's the main thing you have to focus on. This stuff, what's going to happen in the future, and it allows planning kind of allows for more information to be available, so that way executives can make more informed decisions on the organization because they have more information available to them because they planned for it. So that's essentially what, in a broad sense, what organizational planning is. So organizational planning is going to differ from problem solving. The main difference between the two is going to be that time. So problem solving is going to focus on one problem at a time, and it's usually brought up in a current time period. So like right now, this has to be solved. Versus planning, it's going to be months to weeks, weeks to months to years down the road. And you're solving for a problem that's not even existent or hasn't occurred yet. So that's kind of the main difference between problem solving and planning. It's mainly that idea of the time period being either in the future or the current situation. Let's see. So the organizational planning process. So two guys named Hudzik and Gordner outlined some of the elements of organizational planning, and there were just a few. They're not really necessarily in the book. They don't exactly call them like elements and stuff like that, but that's essentially what they are. So prediction and control, that's the focus on either trying to predict or control future problems and issues. So that kind of goes without saying, along with what we just talked about, which was the organizational problem solving. So this is an example of that, where you're predicting future issues and then trying to control for them in the future. So other parts of it include goals, and goals are usually going to be instrumental in nature for criminal justice organizations. And what that means is that we're going to focus more on the means of achieving that goal than we are at getting the outcome. We'd rather make progress than achieve it, because sometimes the outcome is unachievable or super far down the line. So we're more focused on making progress and having good means to achieve it versus actually achieving it. A lot of the times for criminal justice organizations, those goals are going to be handed down by the legislator, courts, the government entities. So a lot of the time we don't get to choose the goals that we focus on for a criminal justice organization, which can be problematic in its own way, but it's usually how it happens. So defining problems and developing procedures. So a defining problem is a problem that is addressing is a certain situation or a gap is a problem between where the organization is and where it needs to be. So there's a gap in between where it is right now, presently, and where it's going to be down the line. So to solve this, organizational planning focuses on like developing procedures and policies to reach goals, as well as addressing that defining problem. You want to create solutions to solve that main issue. And the main key here with organizational planning is that planning, you want to weigh alternative actions. So you want to look at all alternatives and look at like pros and cons list of everything, and to try and pick the best course of action for an organization. So it's very similar to other decision-making processes, like you may use like deciding what classes to take and stuff like that. You may, or like big important life decisions, you make pros and cons lists and tries to weigh out the cost and benefits of each decision that you make. It's very similar for that for organizations as well. So it's important also to talk about the difference between policy analysis and organizational planning. So there is a difference between the two. Policy analysis, like in its name, is going to refer to activities that focus on policy and analyzing that policy. Planning is going to be different than that, and it's going to look at generally what are the effects of different policies and how they're going to affect it in the future. So they're looking at it in the future versus looking at it in the present, and that's the main difference. Policy analyses are going to look heavily at the present, like what is it doing to impact people right this second, versus weeks, months, or years down the line, which would be more of a planning part analysis. So that's the main difference between policy analysis and like organizational planning. So the next thing we're going to talk about is strategic planning. This strategic planning allows organizations to focus on core missions and plan ahead for the future. And it's largely based on knowing where the organization has to be in the future and where they currently are, but also knowing like some of the constraints or like external factors that may hinder getting that desired outcome. It also assumes that change is like a necessary element, so they know that change has to occur for anything to happen. So it capitalizes on the idea that change has to happen no matter what. But yeah, in addition to strategic planning, tactical planning is also involved. And the main difference between that is that tactical planning tends to focus on changes in control and management. So this would be big global changes, such as like changing who is running departments, managing departments, basically that kind of stuff. And it also looks at how the resources within the organization is applied and allocated to different areas. So that's another big thing that it looks at, is how certain resources are going to be allocated to each part of the organization, and how those resources are going to be allocated to achieve those goals, and if there's enough of those resources to do so. So now we're going to talk about gap analysis as well as SWOT analysis. So gap analysis, the big thing is going to focus on that gap. So there's a gap in between where the organization is currently and where they're going to be later on. It's also another term for strategic planning. And it assumes that, like I said, like with strategic planning, it assumes that an organization has to be changed in some way in order to achieve a goal or objective. So it focuses first on what an organization wants to achieve, and then works backward to find like the means to achieve it, as well as the like how we're going to get there. So it's kind of like the idea of going backwards to move forwards. First you got to go take a few steps back and work backwards, work a problem from the solution to figure out how you're going to get there. So that's what I mean by like going backwards to move forwards. So SWOT analysis is a little bit different. SWOT is actually an acronym, and it refers to It means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So what it first does is it examines like organizational strengths. So these are like strengths within the organization and like how these strengths can be used to reach a desired goal. And then you have weaknesses. So it examines weaknesses that an organization has that may hinder their ability to reach that goal. So not having enough resources or not having enough trained personnel or staff may be an example of a weakness within an organization. And then there's two other areas, which is opportunities and threats. So opportunities in a criminal justice context, an opportunity is going to be like a revised or a new service that may be provided. Opportunities for change, essentially. And then threats are going to be anything internal or external that may influence the ability to reach success. So problems down the line that we may be able to take note of and be aware of, such as like politics, climate, those types of things that may influence the success of achieving such a goal. There is a problem. There is a problem with this analysis because it is very rational when criminal justice decisions tend not to be so irrational. They tend to be more irrational and involve ethics, whereas SWOT analysis is very rational and does not. So that's a main issue and problem with the SWOT analysis. Sometimes it's useful to put the SWOT analysis into tables to see if your strengths and opportunities, which are like the positives, outweigh the negatives, which would be your threats and weaknesses, to see if they outweigh it. And that's just a different way to look at everything in a graphical way of looking at things. So we're going to revert back for a little bit and talk about mission statements again. Mission statements with organizational planning can be very important because they can be used to explain why a particular organization exists and how it and why it does the way it does things the way it does. That's what I'm trying to say. Why it does things the way it does. It's also sometimes important to look at vision statements. And vision statements are actually going to be different than your mission statements, and they're going to look at what the organization may look at like down the line in the future, weeks, months to years later. Like I said here, barring strategic planning and constraints, this is what they want. Their expectation is that they want the organization to look like down the line. And then, like I said earlier a little bit, like goals, mission statements for criminal justice organizations are going to be typically handed out by legislation and government entities, meaning that criminal justice organizations don't really get a say in what their mission statement is. They kind of are stuck with whatever they can get. And then value statements are also going to differ, and value statements are more going to refer to values and how that organization will behave in the environment. So also important to examine are goals and objectives, and these kind of differ. You think about it, goals are going to be more general statements on what an organization plans to achieve, but objectives are going to be more specific and observable or measurable, because it's very hard to know if you're achieving an outcome or an objective, know if you're achieving a goal if it's not measurable in some way. So you can't tell if you made any progress when there's no way to test that progress. So I also mentioned this idea of SMART goals, and you've probably heard of this before, which is the specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-specific goals. And these can be helpful to apply to organizational planning when they establish goals and their objectives. But you probably all have heard of SMART goals before in other classes or in high school and stuff like that, like study methods and stuff like that, like what your goals are and such like that. I know I've heard it a bunch of times, so. So the last thing we're really going to talk about, well, not the last thing, but second to last thing, is the idea of logic modeling. Now, there are some examples of logic modeling on page 234 of our text. And I'm going to have a picture example in this presentation as well. But this is widely used for government organizations and criminal justice organizations. It relies on this theory of change, which refers to why we believe that whatever we're changing inside of an organization is going to produce the change we want to produce the change for. So basically, like, why do we think that this change we are making will improve the organization and reach the goals that we want? So this modeling requires us to be super specific on how we will achieve our desired outcomes. And for logic modeling, you're going to start and work backwards, like we talked about before, where you're going to start with looking at outcomes and then working backwards to other parts, which is outputs and inputs and stuff like that. So it's made up of a bunch of relationships between like goals and then how you're going to achieve them. So you think of it as like if-then statements. What if you did this? What would be the result? Stuff like that. So once you have your outcomes decided and they're specific and everything, you then can examine your outputs, which are like your products, like we talked about before, which your outputs would directly relate to your outcome. So it's progress to your outcome. And then your inputs, which would be whatever you're inputting into your resources that you're inputting to create the outputs, which create the outcome. And it's good to remember that these logic modeling, that nothing happens in a vacuum, and everything is will be kind of influenced by like external factors and assumptions. So it's important to model external factors and how you may try to control for them later on. And it's kind of important to keep in mind of that other things may be involved later down the line that may affect your plan. So like I said, there was an example on page 234, but there's another example here, similar. So according to this design, you start, like I said, you work backwards with your outcome and impact. So here it kind of breaks its goals down into like short-term goals, outcomes, intermediate length, and then longer term. What they expect the outcome is going to be longer term. And then you have your outputs, so like the participants involved, what they're going to do, and what products they're going to create. And then you have your input, so that's what you're putting into the model. So you have like staff time, planning time, investments, and stuff like that, what you're going to put into it. And this one also shows you like priorities, like your mission statement, mandates, and everything else in your situation. And then also shows assumptions and sometimes external factors that are involved. Stop. Okay. And the last thing we're going to talk about is the idea of change, and then approaches to like continually examine quality and progress. So we're going to start with readiness for change. So when change occurs in organizations, it doesn't always happen easily. There could be resistance and other issues. So sometimes organizations are going to bring in other people who can consult and decide whether the organization is ready for change. So they may look at like how if there's enough resources to do the change, how these changes will get you to the outcome they want, if the workplace culture is going to be resistant or not, and allow change to happen, if the environment, like external factors, are going to be helpful in getting to that outcome, or if they're going to be more of a hindrance. So that's essentially what the readiness for change idea is in more detail. So the last thing we talk about, and it's very briefly mentioned in the book, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, is the idea of fidelity and continuous quality approaches. So the book doesn't talk about this very long, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. So fidelity in this case is going to be make sure that any program or outcome that they're looking for is going to be high quality and implemented correctly. So a lot of the times if they're trying to implement a evidence-based program, which is something that has like proof that it works, they'll want to make sure that it's implemented in the best possible way and you follow all of the like instructions and everything, so that way it can reach its full potential. And also you're going to have to guarantee that with a there isn't a guarantee that any program that you create and implement is going to work perfectly. So it may not work in this setting, and that's not really your fault unless you didn't set it up to work the way it's supposed to work. So it has that idea of like, if you're doing, you want to make sure you do it right the first time, so that way you don't have to do it all over again. And that's kind of that idea. So you can measure this fidelity and stuff like that through like quality assessment. So periodically you can take time to measure your progress towards your goals, and you can change the plan accordingly when something comes up, or if things are not progressing the way you want it to, you can change the plan up and alter certain things to change it. But yeah. So that pretty much wraps up for this lecture on planning, chapter 13. We've got one more chapter to cover. There's not a lot to cover for this one, for chapter 14, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on chapter 14, and that's going to be it. Can't believe it's already over, but I'm sure y'all are ready to be done, especially those who are graduating. But I'm going to go ahead and do a quick recap of what we covered. So we first started talking about the final exam and what we're going to cover for the exam. And I gave you a couple hints on what to focus on in particular. I didn't give you a study guide, but I gave you a couple hints this time around. The bigger things, especially Merton's mode of adaptation, that is a big thing. Highlight, bold, make sure you cover this, Merton's stuff. So hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So like I said, you get an extra 10 minutes, but it is due on Thursday instead of Friday, the 18th. So that way it gives me more time to prep grades and release grades a little early so you can take a look at it and make sure there's nothing wrong, stuff like that, before I submit to the school and everything. And of course there's going to be that extra credit opportunity. All you have to do is submit either the official evaluation or the SurveyMonkey one. Either way, I'm happy with either one. You don't have to do both. You won't get any extra points if you do both. Just do one, and you'll get your points for your exam. We talked about what organizational planning was and the idea of change versus the planned change. And then talked a little bit about problem solving and how it differs from planning because it focuses on time and either being a current situation or weeks to months to years down the line. We also talked about the difference between policy analysis and planning, and how policy analysis focuses on the current situation, while planning is going to focus more on the future. We also talked about strategic planning and tactical planning, and then gap and SWOT analysis. And we talked about SWOT analysis, which it has different parts, which is the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and how it could be used. We talked a little bit about mission statements again. We talked about this earlier in this semester, so I didn't cover too much about that. SMART goals and logic modeling. Yeah, I showed you an example of a logic model and talked about fidelity, quality assessment, and then readiness for change. So that's pretty much it for this lecture. Like I said, we've got one more and then we're done. So we're towards the end. So if you need any questions, have any questions, comments, or anything about the course, anything in the course, grades and stuff like that, feel free to email and reach out. And hope you all have a great day. Got one more lecture, and I'll see y'all soon.